Have you ever wondered why there are hardly any Gothic people in horror films? You would think people who love darkness and embrace it would be more common in scary movies. We're going to talk about that today in this video. Greetings and salutations, everyone. I am Obsidian Vale, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about goths and horror. So this is something that I was actually thinking about the other day, and I just noticed something. You don't really see too many gothic people in horror films. And I did some research and I took some notes, and I wanted to talk about this with you all because I know that there are some actual goth characters in some horror movies, but not very often. And you don't see actual goth people get cast in these roles. Typically, you see someone pretending to be goth or just doing a watered down version of what goth is. But why is it that you don't see goth people, goth actors cast in these roles most of the time? Since I am an avid horror fan and I've watched many horror movies, I can talk about a few things here. Horror movies have always relied on visual shorthand. Filmmakers want audiences to instantly recognize who's the villain, the victim, and the hero. That's why so many horror films feature archetypes like the blonde cheerleader, the jock, the nerdy kid. These characters are easy to read and their role in the story is almost immediately understood. The goth character, however, doesn't fit neatly into these categories at all. Their dark clothing, heavy makeup, and often rebellious attitude make them stand out, but not in the way that screams danger or innocence to mainstream audiences anyway. This is one reason why goth characters are really rare in horror films. Another reason is that horror films often rely on audience expectations, and a goth character's aesthetic already signals that they're comfortable with darkness. They might read as mysterious, brooding, or even fearless. And this undermines the typical horror dynamic, where characters are supposed to look relatable and then be thrust into just scary situations. A goth character surviving a haunted house or monster attack doesn't create the same tension as someone who looks completely unprepared. In many ways, the presence of a goth in horror challenges the genre's rules about who is vulnerable. Now, do I agree with this? No. I do believe just because you're gothic and you embrace the darkness doesn't mean that you cannot portray the role of the victim, though most of the time we are not victims. We are usually strong personas, so I understand that. But honestly, a gothic protagonist is something that almost never happens. But it would be wonderful to have that. When we talk about goth characters in horror, it's important to separate gothic atmosphere from actual goth people. And horror as a genre loves dark themes. So spooky visuals, creepy settings, but that doesn't necessarily mean it gives us characters who represent the goth subculture. So let's break down some of the notable films and shows from the last few years and look at how they handle gothic elements and goth style characters. A lot of you may be familiar with a lot of these. Historically, goth characters in horror films have been few and far in between. One of the most iconic examples is Lydia Deetz from Beetlejuice. I know many people are familiar with that. So Lydia is played by Winona Ryder, and Lydia is a true gothic character. I mean, many people have emulated her style, and she's basically a gothic icon in cinema. She's pale, dressed in black, fascinated by the macabre. While Beetlejuice blends comedy and horror, Lydia embodies the gothic outsider in the horror-adjacent world, showing that the goth aesthetic can work in scary settings when handled thoughtfully. And I think Beetlejuice did that brilliantly. Now, while this may not count as horror exactly, I think also the Addams Family fits into this mold as well. So if it was any type of horror, it's more comedy than horror, but based on the atmosphere, it has like horror elements. So I don't consider the Addams Family horror exactly, but I do think that's another good example, even many years later. Now, with The Crow, even though it leans more towards the action dark fantasy genre, Eric Draven's aesthetic is thoroughly Gothic. Obviously, I mean, many people see him as Gothic. His pale face, black clothing, and brooding presence create a terrifying but sympathetic figure. And while not your typical horror teen terror story, The Crow shows how a goth character can be central, compelling, and visually aligned with the dark atmosphere of the story. It's also important to note that the mainstream horror often conflates gothic aesthetics with villainy, which is a big no-no because I don't like that one. Just something I think is definitely overdone. I think it has limited that diversity of goth roles. Films like Jennifer's Body or some slasher entries have occasionally leaned on Gothic-inspired looks for antagonists or morally ambiguous characters. And this reinforces the idea that goth characters are either creepy, dangerous, or otherworldly, rather than just teenagers navigating through terror like everyone else. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be teenagers as well, it's adults too. The rarity of goth characters is also tied to accessibility. Horror audiences are massive, and studios often prefer characters who are immediately relatable to the widest demographic. Goth characters with their distinctive fashion and sometimes niche cultural references risk alienating viewers who don't understand or connect with the subculture. This means that filmmakers rarely take the risk of featuring fully authentic goth characters as a lead. Yet when a goth character does appear, they often survive longer than the average horror archetype. Their comfort with darkness, their skepticism, and their outsider mentality equip them to navigate situations that unprepared, normal characters cannot. This subversion is one of the reasons fans of goth subculture often cheer for those rare characters. They defy the genre's predictable rules. There are also films that incorporate gothic aesthetics into the horror environment itself. Even if the characters aren't explicitly goth, Tim Burton's work, like Sleepy Hollow, often dresses the entire world in gothic tones. I know many of you are familiar with his works. In these films, the goth aesthetic becomes part of the atmosphere, making the characters who are already darkly dressed feel right at home. Still, truly gothic characters in these settings are usually in supporting roles rather than central leads. Lisa Frankenstein came out in 2024. This is a horror comedy about a misunderstood teenage girl who resurrects a corpse and embarks on a bizarre, murderous journey. And it mixes romance, comedy, and horror with a distinctly gothic vibe. I mean, you look at her clothes, you can tell that she's leaning more towards the gothic vibe for that time period. The main character style, outsider energy, and ironic take on classic horror tropes make it one of the few recent films where we see a teen character who visually and thematically leans into gothic identity. Now, like I said, it isn't straight horror, but it's one of those rare mainstream movies where gothic fashion and outsider identity feel intentional and central. Then there's Frankenstein. This is a movie that came out recently, but is very popular within the gothic community because it's considered gothic horror. And Guillermo del Toro adaptation of Mary Shelley's classic. This version premiered at major festivals and then eventually ended up on Netflix. It was deeply, I don't know, I connected with it very well, me being gothic. And it has stunning visuals and a deeply atmospheric tone, and it dives into themes like creation, decay, loneliness, and different levels of moral character, all core elements of gothic horror. But it's important to note that while the atmosphere is gothic, the characters rooted in the literary horror are not modern gothic subculture. Though at that time, I guess it's probably the closest you can get to it based on the personality of some of the characters. There aren't any goth kids wandering around. Instead, the story uses traditional gothic themes to tell a narrative, which makes it gothic horror. Dracula, the most recent one, directed by Luc Besson, brings Bram Stoker's vampire myth to life with dramatic flair. This adaptation is rich with shadowy castles, cursed love, and classic vampire imagery. Though vampires aren't necessarily gothic exactly, those two can intertwine into the gothic subculture. Like Frankenstein, it embraces the tone and visuals of gothic storytelling, but it doesn't give us characters who are a part of today's gothic subculture. I mean, it really couldn't based on the time period. We get old world gothic, not black lipstick gothic. Moving on from movies to series, we also have Penny Dreadful. Penny Dreadful, just my personal opinion, is a phenomenal series. If you haven't watched it, I recommend it. And it's a standout example of gothic horror done right on screen. Though not a film, this show weaves Victorian-era supernatural tales with characters like Vanessa Ives, whose haunted presence and dark inner world, and she's tortured, mysterious, and deeply connected to the macabre. Not necessarily because of a fashion choice, but because it's the essence of her identity. Her identity is just gothic in itself. And that's closer to what many people think of as goth in spirit. The Victorian fashion is often intertwined with gothic fashion as well. Then there's Wednesday, the supernatural mystery comedy series centered on Wednesday Addams. And she is played by Jenna Ortega, and this is a very popular gothic icon currently during this time. And with her deadpan delivery and black wardrobe and fascination with the macabre and outsider identity, she's one of the most visibly gothic aligned characters in the horror style shows in the recent times. Her presence proves that when they see depth and personality, not just aesthetic, you can bring something great. Now, this is not a movie that's commonly talked about, and I just found out about it fairly recently. There's this horror film called Mirror Mirror, which came out in 1990. It's another interesting case. The supernatural slasher features a shy teenage outcast named Megan, played with goth-leaning personality traits. And her role as the unpopular outsider drawn into darkness gives the film a cult horror feeling. And that's closer to the goth subculture than most slashers ever get. With its haunted mirror and dark reflection theme, the movie blends supernatural scares with a protagonist who visually and thematically fits a gothic profile more than most horror leads. What happens if we compare all of these? A pattern emerges. Films like Frankenstein and Dracula lean into gothic themes, decay, loss, forbidden knowledge, without giving us goth characters. Penny Dreadful and Wednesday give us characters who feel gothic in identity and narrative weight. And Lisa Frankenstein and Mirror Mirror give us gothic style youth characters. But even then, it's rare in mainstream horror for those characters to be the center of the story. What this tells us is while gothic elements are everywhere in horror, dimly lit settings, haunted imagery, supernatural dread, it's still uncommon for mainstream films to give us characters who embody modern goth subculture the way you might expect. Horror often uses gothic aesthetics as mood or theme, but not as true character identity. So when you look at the horror landscape today, from gothic literary adaptations to horror comedy outsiders to iconic goth figures like Wednesday, it becomes clear why goth characters still feel rare. They're out there, but they're the exception, not the rule. I want to give a brief example of my own experience with this. A few years back, I was asked to do a role in a horror film, and I did practice and I did my best. You know, they asked me to do it. I didn't seek them out. But instead of choosing me, a naturally gothic character, they chose someone who was, as you can guess, that fits more into the mainstream. I was really disappointed by this, and there were some complications with the director and the writer and a little bit of drama going on behind those scenes. But later on, I found out that their short film flopped, and I took an initiative of my own to make my own horror film, a really short horror film, which actually turned out to do much better than what they did. And then there was also other films that I tried to take a role in, and they just didn't want a Gothic character. So that just goes to show that they do often pick the characters who look like they could play the victim role really good, or they just don't actually want a Gothic person to be the antagonist, or they just want someone to dress up like that. They want someone more versatile, I guess. But do I think Gothic people can be versatile? Absolutely. I think many movies should give Gothic people a chance, and they could surprise us. I mean, look what they did with Wednesday. But Tim Burton's excellent with the whole Gothic themes. In conclusion, the scarcity of goth characters in horror films is the result of visual shorthand, audience expectations, and studio conservatism. When goth characters do appear, they are often peripheral, observant, and morally ambiguous. However, their presence challenges traditional horror dynamics and adds depth to the story. From Lydia Dietz to Eric Draven, these characters show that goths in horror can be compelling, unique, and frankly unforgettable. Even if they remain the rare exceptions in the genre, dominated by predictable archetypes, you never forget the goth character, and they become icons. A lot of them do become icons from not just a year that these films are released, but years to come. Thank you for watching this. Please let me know your opinions on goth people in horror. If I missed any horror films or series, please definitely let me know in the comments down below. Let me know your opinions about this. I would love to hear it. I do check my comments. Thank you for watching, everyone. I will see you soon.